Jane is a mother of 2 children, a beautiful girl called Purity and a handsome boy called John. Jane and her husband have been married for 10 years. Jane's husband had lost his job earlier that year and had traveled overseas in search for greener pastures. The salary that he got was barely enough for his needs overseas, let alone to send to his family back home. Back home, Jane worked as a secretary for a small company. There was a lot of work in that company, but with a very small pay. For Jane and her family, money was scarce, and all that they could afford were the basic needs. Prices had gone up, making life more difficult for this family. They were simply struggling to make ends meet. Jane's life was very hectic, to say the least. She couldn't afford to hire help, so she had to do everything on her own. She would wake up very early in the morning, prepare breakfast for the family, clean up a bit, and also prepare her kids for school and herself for work before heading out the door. After dropping the kids to school, she would then rush to work. After school, Jane's firstborn daughter, Purity, would take care of her brother until their mother came home to cook and clean up. Jane would then rush home quickly after work in order to take care of her kids and do all the pending house chores. All this had left Jane feeling so exhausted. She had no break and no time for herself. It had been work after work, and also there was the worry about their finances, which was getting to her. She was getting sadder by the day. During the school holidays, Jane left Purity in charge of taking care of her little brother, who was 3 years old. She would make sure that the children had everything that they needed, packed and ready for them. Purity was 7 years old, and by now she knew what she had to do. One day, she left for work as usual and left strict instructions for her daughter to follow. Purity was a very obedient girl and would try her best to follow her mother's instructions. Purity had already noticed how her mother came home very exhausted. On that day, she decided to help her mom out by washing the dishes. She had never washed the dishes before, but she had watched her mom many times while she washed them. She went to the sink and started with the plates, using the soap that she had found on top of the kitchen counter. By bad luck, some of the plates slipped and fell on the floor, breaking into pieces. Purity was shocked. This was now beyond her. She panicked and left the kitchen at once, with the broken plates and soapy water all over the kitchen floor. As usual, Jane rushed home from work, and by 8 p.m. she was already at home, tired but ready for the next job. She entered the house and greeted the children warmly and was happy to see that they were all okay. On reaching the kitchen, she was shocked. The kitchen was a mess. There was water everywhere, and there were broken pieces of her favorite plates everywhere. Her head started pounding with an oncoming headache. She felt as if the world was against her. The more she looked at the mess, the angrier she became. At last, she called Purity to the kitchen and asked her what had happened. Purity fearfully explained what had happened. She could see how angry her mother was and immediately started crying. When she finished explaining, she started hastily getting out of the kitchen. Suddenly, she slid and fell on the soapy kitchen floor with a thud, hurting her leg in the process. She started crying while holding her leg, making her mother to panic. Jane feared that her child's leg might be badly hurt and started praying for it not to be so. Jane managed to take Purity to the nearest hospital. On observation, the doctors discovered that Purity had just dislocated her ankle, but it would heal in no time. Jane was filled with regret and guilt as she took her baby back home. When they reached home, she put the children to sleep as they had slept all the way from the hospital. She watched as her daughter slept peacefully, all the while having a mixture of relief, regret, and guilt in her heart. Jane came to the realization that Purity wanted to help her. The little girl had meant no harm, but had wanted to help her out. She felt overwhelming love for her children and knew that anger is the worst advisor of all. And she knew that she would never again let anger overcome her like that. Jane now knew that in life we should not dwell on our problems too much that we forget about our blessings. We may lack in some areas, but there's just that one thing or that one person that makes us blessed beyond measure.